Hey everyone, this is Sunny Justice from It's a Criming Shame. Now, of course, before we get into it, please, if you are not a subscriber, subscribe to this channel and give a like and a share to this video. Thank you so much. Okay, so breaking news in the Bryan Kohberger case, which is the IDAHO4. Now, this is stuff that we have not heard before, and even I'm sitting there going, wow, what did we just learn? We learned a lot of stuff. Now, Ashley Banfield on News Nation, of course, did about a 5-minute video, which I'll show you guys in a minute. And then on top of that, there was another video that she did with a gentleman, or I should say live, with this gentleman talking about it. Again, this is like what I call like some breaking information, absolutely, because this gives us a lot more insight to what was going on prior to the IDAHO4 of November 13th of 2022. So let's get into it and take a look.
I think it's important because in the Idaho case, there's been a lot of focus on the chief defendant in the case, Bryan Kohberger. And now we are learning a few things were happening in that man's life leading up to and right after. Things like being investigated by his own school, Washington State University, where he was working as a teaching assistant. And apparently the investigation wasn't going well. He was warned time after time after time to cut back on the bad behavior. We're told behavioral problems specifically. But time after time after time, he didn't. He got more feisty and belligerent, even arguing with his professors, until they finally decided, you're fired. That's right. Bryan Kohberger was fired as a teaching assistant from Washington State University. I have the actual specifics of this, and I wanted to sort of go through what we have come to learn was the sort of timeline of his warnings and all of the things that were listed on a termination letter that Kohberger himself was given right before they cut the cord with him. So I'm going to just watch some of these so I don't get them wrong. But the highlights, or lowlights, I guess you might call them, was that he had a sexist attitude towards females that he interacted with at the school, that he was rude to the women, and then get this, as a teaching assistant, he apparently graded the women differently than he graded the men. Here is the alleged language that was included in his termination letter along with the timeline, starting on September 23rd. And by our math, that's about 1 month into his brand new job as a teaching assistant in his doctoral program, which may or may not have been tied to his teaching job. September 23rd, Kohberger apparently has an altercation with one of the professors named Dr. Snyder. Just 10 days later, on October 3rd, the letter outlines that they had met to, quote, discuss the norms of professional behavior. And then 18 days after that, on October the 21st, Dr. Snyder emails Bryan Kohberger to say that he has, quote, failed to meet the expectations that were outlined in the discussions they'd had before. 12 days after that, on November the 2nd, they met again to discuss what they called an improvement plan. And then on December the 7th, that's about, well, let's cut to actually 12 days later, it's 11 days later, the murders actually happened. So they have the meeting to discuss the improvement plan. And 11 days later, on November 13th, the murders are carried out. Then cut forward to 24 days beyond, and that's December 7th. That's when there was another meeting with the professors, and this was supposed to be about the progress of the, quote, improvement plan. Apparently it didn't go too well because 2 days later, on December 9th, he had another altercation with Dr. Snyder, and here's the quote, in which it became apparent that you had not made progress regarding professionalism. 10 days after that, December 19th, Bryan Kohberger is officially terminated by Washington State University. And some are reporting that he was withdrawn from the data system 3 days later on December the 22nd. 2nd. Dr. Bond, you probably just heard the breaking news that we just reported on all of these conflagrations that Bryan Kohberger seemed to have been having with his professors, with his students, and with other people among the staff, to the point where he was cut loose. He was fired from Washington State University from his teaching job. I just wanted to get your initial reactions to sort of that behavioral profile as you look at then now what he's accused of.
Oh, absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me on this evening. And I wanted to say, I was thinking about this myself. I was a TA. When I was getting my PhD at the University of Miami, I was a TA, and that TA position was tied to my funding, my assistantship that paid for my entire education. So that is not something you want to lose. You do not want to risk losing something like that. And the fact that it escalated so quickly and that he was terminated in his first semester there would suggest to me that his behavior really was egregious, that it was something that had become a big problem for the department and the university. And so I wanted to just give that as a little bit of background. But to the extent that that this letter, which I don't believe the letter has been completely authenticated yet, but if it is in fact true and the timeline is true, then this is something that could have absolutely contributed to him reaching a tipping point in his rage and anger and leading him to strike out in this terrible.
Yeah, we don't have our hands on the letter yet, but we've had the essence of it authenticated by a source close to the investigation, and that's the next best thing without actually getting your hands on a copy of the termination letter. And obviously, when it comes to those kinds of, staff and policy, obviously administrative staff policies, employment records are pretty private. It's hard to get your hands on those things. But I'm curious about, I was so curious when you said that for you, the teaching assistant job was tied to the actual program. And I'm guessing that that's not a far stretch to suggest the accommodations that were on campus as well might have been part of that too. So there could have been a lot of stress. What I can't understand is the utter bravado that it would take if all of that was on the line and you're getting warning after warning and a helping hand to try to work through your problems. What kind of personality do you think this is that would literally thumb his nose at the authority that hold his future in their hands?
Great question. And this crime that he committed, but I've been saying for some time now that the more that we learn about him, his development and his progression seems more similar to a serial killer. And I've studied serial killers extensively for some time. And so this didn't just happen, Ashley. I think that he was evolving, developing over a period of time. And he reached a tipping point where he simply couldn't take it anymore. And he had to act out on his fantasy. And so something like this, where the rug had been pulled out from under him, his funding, his home, as you said, which I do believe was probably tied to his assistantship and his TA position, it could have just pushed him over the edge to the point that he had to act out. And because the escalation was already there. As you said, he was in trouble by September, by October. He knew that he was in deep trouble by then.
Well, he still has the presumption of innocence, and these are allegations against him until they're proven in a court of law. So I'm still just so astounded by the sexism and the allegations that he was grading the women differently than the men, and that to me would be a big, red flag for those teachers, or should have been, and perhaps they did catch it very quickly as they started right in September. Can't thank you enough. So it's just so enlightening, Dr. Bond. Thank you. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Have a good evening.